Good morrow. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Kate Burgess, and I'm the Conservation Program Manager with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. We're really happy that you're here today. Before we start, I'd just like to give an offering in recognition of the systematic exclusion of Indigenous peoples in what is currently known as the United States from very critical decisions that relate to the conservation and health of land, water, and wildlife and people that to a great degree are still happening. So the next hour is really aimed at addressing that exclusion but more broadly offering policy opportunities for states to fully recognize their responsibility as treaty partners and to offer steps forward through options such as returning land back and wildlife rematriation. We have a really fantastic panel today, and I'm grateful to every one of you who's taken the time to be here and learn. And so to kick things off, I'm going to pass things over to Brittany Schulman, who is the Senior VP of Programs with Native Americans in Philanthropy. Brittany is an enrolled citizen of the Waccamaw Siouan tribe, is a traditional storyteller, organizer, and fortunately for you, you are a moderator for the next hour. Brittany?
Thank you so much, Kate. Tanake Harurara, thank you so much for coming and joining and being part of this very critical conversation as we talk about important aspects of Indigenous peoples and their inclusion in state legislatures. So at this time, I would like to welcome to the stage Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. She's White Earth Ojibwe. Please come and tell us who you are and how you became involved in tribal state relations.
Well, Buju, good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here with you. Peggy Flanagan, Indigenous Kaz, Gishwe, Widam, Ukwe, Indigo, Gawabaga, Ganikagnan, Junshaba, Mangan Node. My name is Peggy Flanagan. That's my English name. My Ojibwe name Speaks with a Clear and Loud Voice Woman. I am a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, and my family is the Wolf Clan. I also happen to be the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Minnesota, and so the way that I came into this work and specifically looking at tribal state relations was through my role. I served the opportunity to serve in the legislature in Minnesota, becoming the second Native woman elected to serve in the Minnesota legislature, and then was elected lieutenant governor. And so much of the work that the governor and I try to do is really centered on trying to do this work in a good way and to try to do this work in a way where other states can look to what we're doing in Minnesota as a model for how we can do this work from here on out. We've been headed in the same direction in the state of Minnesota for a very long time. So trying to turn things around is a large task, but it is the work that we are required as states to do. And you shouldn't have to have an Anishinaabe Kwe as lieutenant governor in order to do this work. So my hope is that I can share a bit about the work that we've been able to do here in Minnesota throughout this panel and learn also from you and from the professor about what opportunities might still be ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. Also coming to this conversation, we're inviting Professor Robert J. Miller, who is at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to meet you, Lieutenant Governor. I'm glad to be on this program with you. I am a professor. I teach Indian law. I work with tribes and write on the issues of Indian law since 1993. I've been teaching and working in this field, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm a tribal judge for several different tribes. I've written 5 books on Indian law issues, and I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe. So I'm very glad to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Miller. We were going to have Representative Lekinoff from Washington State. Unfortunately, she could not join us, so we will be continuing our conversation with our two guests that are here with us. So I want to start just asking the question, why should states center tribal governance and sovereignty in their decision making? And I'll start with the Lieutenant Governor, if you will.
Sure. So I think, one, it's a really good way to get great results for everyone who lives in your state. I think, we have certainly seen that when Native folks are doing well, when tribes are doing well in our state, everyone benefits. And that is the lens that we try to bring to this work. But as leaders of a state that shares land with 11 tribal nations, Governor Walz and I have really prioritized working with each tribal nation to build government to government relationships. Tribal nations are not stakeholders, and I think that that's a really important thing to name. We might think of, in the same way that we might think of like a advocacy organization or a nonprofit, and too often I think that is how folks approach working with Native nations. We understand that they are separate sovereign nations, and we must respect as unique and individual nations with the right to existence, self-governance, and self-determination. This is important, of course, because, as you all know, each tribe has an inherent authority to govern itself. And that is where you have to start with these conversations. And part of honoring tribal sovereignty means that as a state, we must regularly speak with and meet with and listen to tribal leaders when creating and amending state policies that have direct and substantial effect on their communities. The states must trust tribes have the best solutions for their people. And I think that comes from this deep relationship building that we've been able to do over the last several years. And as states, we must recognize when tribal nations do well, again, our entire states thrive. They are our partners. They are economic drivers in their regions, and have provided tremendous opportunity to their own tribal citizens as well as surrounding communities. They provide jobs and healthcare for their community, for their employees, for the families of their employees, and they provide policing and infrastructure. They manage natural resources and so much more. And so I think one of the most powerful example of this was during the COVID pandemic, when my tribe, the White Earth Nation, started administering vaccinations to its people. Realizing that they had enough to go around, it opened its clinics to their non-native neighbors and started vaccinating folks who lived in surrounding communities. So the county where White Earth is, Monoman County, was an early leader in the state among counties and percentage of people who were vaccinated. It was really powerful. And I think when state-centered tribal governance and sovereignty in their decision-making, we will help ensure that tribal nations are doing well, but we also know that we get better results as a state when we are also learning from the things that have been implemented by the Native nations themselves. And I would just say that we really view this work as not a nice to have, it is a must have. And as a state, we are called to do this work. And, we don't always get it right. We don't always agree. And I will just name that being a Native woman who is part of state government, it is hard, and there are challenges. But I think there also are opportunities for us to be at these decision-making tables in a way that we haven't been previously. And I think that we can see that in a lot of the policy outcomes that we've had, that we've literally put in place and created together with tribal leaders themselves and with community.
Thank you so much. I think that you're in naming that it is difficult to be a Native person working in state legislature and state governments. It's absolutely true, but also it gives you that edge because most folks don't really understand or have that knowledge of tribal governance and sovereignty. And so, Professor, bringing the question to you, why should states center tribal governance and sovereignty in their decision making?
Well, it makes good sense. As the Lieutenant Governor said, I'm going to repeat probably a couple of things that she said. It just makes sense. Indian peoples are citizens of the United States, of their own tribal governments, and of the states they live in. So states have an obligation to serve the interests of all their citizens. And so to ignore tribes because of longstanding situations or antipathy is just bad decision making. The lieutenant governor already said also that this leads to better results. The more that state leaders and tribal leaders and federal leaders, of course, the more they can hear, the more suggestions they have, and the more cooperation they can engage in with other shareholders, the better the results will be. Now, I live and work in Arizona. 27% of the state of Arizona is owned by Indian nations. Oklahoma, because of a Supreme Court case from 3 years ago, is now 43% Indian country and has 39 federally recognized tribes. Arizona, we have 22 federally recognized tribes. Minnesota has 11 federally recognized tribes. And I looked in vain online trying to find how much land of the percentage of your state they own, Lieutenant Governor. But there are some massive reservations in your state, excuse me. So state officials have to govern for all the people and for the full state. And it only makes sense to work with tribal leaders. One of you mentioned sovereignty. Of course, tribes are mentioned in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of our Constitution, that is the Interstate Commerce Clause, is also called by the United States Supreme Court the Indian Commerce Clause. So tribes are one of the three forms of government in our political system, and they must work together if we're going to create best results for all citizens.
Thank you so much, Professor. And with that, I want to slide to this next question that centers around state legislators and what you wish they knew. As I mentioned before, often unfortunately, we're not taught American history in the sense that we're not taught the history of the first peoples of this land. We're not really given a good understanding of tribal governments and sovereignty and how that interacts at all different levels. So what is it that you wish state legislators knew about treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, particularly when it comes to environmental decision making? And I'm going to pass that back to the Lieutenant Governor.
Sure. Well, there's a lot that I wish that state legislators knew. I will say one thing, even as a former legislator, I wish that they knew that we existed. And it really, before we can even start to talk about treaty rights and sovereignty and how that impacts environmental law and decision making, literally on my last day on the House floor, when I gave my closing speech, I had a member come up to me and say, "Hey, I didn't realize you were Native American. I thought all of you were dead."
Oh,
and
wow.
this was, yeah. And I just sort of didn't, I was like, surprise, right? Like, I don't think, it was, and I know that as Indian people, we hear those things all the time. I think you just don't expect to hear it when you are a member of a body where absolutely this representative had Native people in his district. And the fact that we had at the time a caucus of 4 Native women just means like he wasn't paying attention. And so I think I really do believe that there are that simply understanding, and we've all seen the study from Illuminative that said, roughly 40% of Americans don't know that Native Americans still exist, and certainly don't know that we still exist as contemporary people. So I think like that is like half the battle, is making sure that people know that we are still here, we are contemporary people, and that treaty rights are the supreme law of the land, and that they need to know and understand that a good reminder is always that that we are treaty people, meaning that as Indigenous people, we're a treaty people, but people who are non-Native also are part of those treaties. And I think that's something that we need to remember and continue to educate people about. So, Professor, I will leave a lot of this to you. I am not an Indian law professor, but we'll say, like, I recognize that there are really complex, it's a complex question because of federal Indian law, jurisdiction, and civil and criminal differences. And I am not an expert in any of that, like Professor Miller is, but I do know what it's like to try to be an Anishinaabe in the legislature. As an enrolled member of the White Earth Nation, I understand my tribe's treaty rights and our tribal sovereignty. But that really is, there's the lack of knowledge there in a lot of these decision-making bodies. And so even though I represented a first-ranked suburb of Minneapolis, I also knew that I had the responsibility to represent my own people when I was in that space as well. But being here in Minnesota, we are really starting to see this narrative shift, and it is because we are at a lot of these tables. Starting in 2019, our legislature began hosting Sovereignty Day in the legislature. And so for Sovereignty Day, tribal leaders from all the 11 tribes that share geography with Minnesota Makoche participated in a joint session of the state legislature. So this is an educational event where legislators learn about tribal culture, history, directly from tribal leaders themselves. They also have breakout sessions where they can dig into legislative priorities of the tribe, like gaming or the legalization of adult use cannabis, the environment and education. So I think it's been really beneficial. And then we have a responsibility as the executive branch to build these relationships, and the state legislators have a responsibility as a branch of government to build these relationships as well. So it's made a big difference. And I would also say, though, as we look at environmental policy, knowing that many of the practices that Indigenous people have held since time immemorial for how to care for our resources and maintain them, now suddenly, right, they're like, oh, that's what science tells us as well, right? And so we're like, welcome to the party. We know what works. But I think that that's also part of making sure that we are starting to incorporate into the way that we talk about these issues, Indigenous ways of knowing and things that have been a part of Native nations for a long time. And if there's a way that a tribe is managing a particular resource, that we should also take time to learn from that, because there's probably something there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And so, as the Lieutenant Governor said, we'll pass it to you, Professor, for the legalese or the legal background, or the little bit more information on what state legislators should know when it comes to treaty rights and tribal sovereignty, or what we wish they knew, in particular as it relates to environmental decision making.
Well, again, I have to back up and repeat most of what Lieutenant Governor said. She obviously is modest about her constitutional knowledge, but she is fully aware of the things she already mentioned. Tribes are governments. Our founding fathers understood that. People are arguing all the time about originalism and how we should read the Constitution. Well, there was no question what our founding fathers understood about Indian nations. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 that I already mentioned, James Madison, the father of our Constitution, wrote that provision. And in fact, our U.S. Constitution today kind of came about because of Indian affairs and how states had been messing around in Indian affairs and causing troubles for the United States. I've written an article or two on this and given talks you can see on YouTube if you want, about the influence that Indian nations, Indian peoples, and Indian law had on the U.S. Constitution itself. And so I would want state legislatures. It's appalling what you just said, Lieutenant Governor, that someone walks up to you, gosh, are you people still alive? I mean, that's shocking. But let me give you a statistic that might surprise you. We have 435 representatives in our U.S. House of Representatives, right? Only 85 of those 435 congressmen and women have a tribe in their district. I'm not too good at math. That sounds like 80% also asked that same question, Lieutenant Governor. Tribes, Indian law, what, we federal government, we have a responsibility, we have what? Treaties. So yes, the American public is so woefully ignorant about our current existence, our current capabilities, our current lands, and yes, our treaty rights. And Lieutenant Governor mentioned that. So Article 6 of the Constitution is the treaty clause, which says very clearly that the treaties are the supreme law of the land. So tribes like my own that signed 11 treaties with the United States, the tribes in Minnesota, and I am from Oregon, so I've got to mention the tribes from Oregon and the treaties they signed. Those are still the governing documents of the United States. And the Constitution says that state judges must honor the treaties, notwithstanding what state law says to the contrary. So treaty rights are supreme law of the land. And I guess I just wanted to say one other point that might sound a little negative, but one reason we have these conflicts, even to this day, and maybe this absence of knowledge about Native peoples, the Supreme Court noted this in 1886 in the Kagama case. And I believe I can quote you this. The United States Supreme Court wrote that, quote, often the deadliest enemies of the tribes are the inhabitants of the state where they are located, period, close quote. So what does that mean? Well, that's where the rubber hits the road, right? That's where the battle over land, water, timber, minerals, that's where the battle occurs. And, you know, Washington, D.C. can kind of be aloof maybe to some of these issues, but where the battle hits is where the conflicts arise. And so what both of us have already mentioned, and you asked me, Brittany, to think of this in the environmental arena. When we have environmental problems, we all need those solved. The weather issues we're feeling right now, the heat dome over Phoenix, the heat dome over the Southwest, the smoke fires that you folks probably suffered just in Minnesota, certainly Chicago and Detroit and New York City were hit. These are issues we need every oar pulling. We need everyone helping. And so tribal legislators and governments are hurting themselves if they ignore one of their allies who might have the ear of the federal government better even than the state does. And I wonder if any of you have thought about this. When tribes have treaty rights, when the United States owes tribes a legal trust duty, tribes may be your best voice in the halls of Congress when you're visiting your senator and visiting the congressmen and women and arguing for what Minnesota might need or what my Arizona might need. So instead of battling and fighting each other, we have got to work forward to the best goals, and we need everyone helping. So state legislators or state governments that aren't using and relying on their natural allies and instead turning them into enemies, that is so short-sighted and detrimental to the environment and any other issue we might be talking about, the economy, social issues, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you so much, Professor Miller. And to quote you, it just makes good sense. I'm going to switch it up a little bit and start with you, Professor. Do you have any examples in mind of innovative and effective partnerships or policies between states and tribes that are contributing to the flourish for all? And what are the elements of those partnerships that allow them to flourish? So starting first with you, Professor.
Thank you. I just briefly thought about this, and the Lieutenant Governor already mentioned one that I was unaware of, Minnesota meeting with the, what did you call that, tribal legislative day or something, and tribal leaders will come there. Like I said, I was born and raised in Oregon and spent most of my life there. In 1975, the Oregon legislature enacted the Oregon Commission on Indian Services. There is one senator, one representative on it, and a representative from all 9 of the federally recognized tribes in Oregon. And there's a full-time staff, executive director, et cetera. They work on issues of state tribal interaction and hopefully benefit. And they meet regularly, and I think they do go to the legislature, but they may not even do it to the extent that you just defined, Lieutenant Governor. So that is an excellent thought. Now, I'm also just aware of a few other things. I believe in Wisconsin and Minnesota, the state judges meet fairly regularly with tribal judge associations, and they work on policies of mutual interest. I mean, just use child support. When an Indian child lives on a reservation for a while, but then maybe down in Minneapolis or a different part of your state, how do we coordinate child support orders? and alimony, or not alimony, child support payments, etc. And I do want to mention one other point. Almost every state has what are called cooperative agreements with the tribal nations within their state. The state of Oklahoma has about 650 as of 3 years ago, and they probably have hundreds more now that this decision was rendered 3 years ago. When I was practicing law, I was negotiating cross-deputization agreements. Tribal governments want law and order just as much as any community does. Much of Indian country is crying out for, law and order. We need more police officers, not less. If you know anything about the Navajo Nation, folks, where I live in Arizona, it's as big as the state of West Virginia, but it has about 200 officers. How many officers does the state of West Virginia have? 10,000? I mean, I'm just guessing there. I don't know. But Navajo knows they need more law enforcement. The tribes in Minnesota no doubt would love to, and maybe already are, the lieutenant governor can tell us. But you asked me, Brittany, for examples. These cross-deputization agreements where tribal police officers can enforce state law and state officers can perhaps enforce tribal law to provide better and more complete criminal coverage, criminal protection coverage for us all. That goes back to our environmental discussion. That's a win-win situation and makes life safer for all of us. So these cross-deputization agreements, the cooperative agreements that states enter into about issues of the environment, water use, all sorts of things. These are examples of what you asked me about.
Thank you so much. Those are all really good examples and a wide array of issues that our peoples are facing and our communities are facing. And Lieutenant Governor, I'm going to bring it back to you. I know you shared some examples earlier. Could you share a few more? Do you have any other examples of effective partnerships and policies, and what are the effective elements of those?
Sure, absolutely. And Professor, I want to take your class. Yeah, writing them down, taking notes.
You can zoom in, Governor.
I love it. Well, those are great examples. And yes, we have some of those agreements with law enforcement, and it's been really powerful and absolutely matters. So thank you for, it also helps that Leech Lake member is the chair of our judiciary committee in the legislature. So having an Ojibwe woman to be the chair of that committee also helps as we are getting through issues of jurisdiction. And because, of course, we are a public law 280 state, we have to cross-coordinate and help support tribes with local law enforcement all the time. But we've been very intentional about it. So the governor and I prioritized increased communication and coordination and consultation across state government. And we've tried to build really authentic partnerships and relationships with each tribal nation. Within months of taking office, the governor signed something called Executive Order 1924. And it was 1924 on purpose. But this expanded previous executive orders to require all state agencies to participate in annual consultation with the tribes and to have a tribal liaison on staff within each state agency. So that means that our state agencies are now required to engage in meaningful consultation on everything from housing to the economy, to education, to cannabis, which we just legalized in Minnesota. And each of our 26 state agencies now have tribal consultation policies in place. And then we rescinded that executive order for good reason, because it was actually signed into state law, is now required within Minnesota. So a group of tribal attorneys and other folks appointed by the tribes helped to draft the legislation. They were brought into weekly meetings by our tribal state relations team. We have an office within the office of the governor, and we are currently studying how we want to make that permanent, that office. But the bill passed really quickly with overwhelming bipartisan support. And I think, Professor, this is also to your point. We don't have to make assumptions about the political parties or political leanings of each tribal nation. We have worked well with, folks of all parties. We have had conflict with folks of all parties. And so I think that's important just for state legislators in particular to really keep in mind. A relationship is a relationship, and tending to it and building it really matters. So we also recognize the importance of having staff with expertise in our tribal state relations, and also having expertise in federal Indian law inside our own governor's office. So when grant funding for our tribal state relations office ran out, that's how we originally started it. Our legislature looked a little bit different too when we began this work. We added it now to our budget as a permanent standalone department within the governor's office. We're now in our second term and really building on that momentum. And these relationships really remain a priority because we need to make sure that this work continues after we are no longer in these positions. And so the legislature has a really important responsibility there too, to continue funding this work, but also to maintain those relationships. We're moving forward really with a focus on reciprocity, so that it is not just one-sided. And we know that we can't do everything that we need to within just a few years or 2 terms, but we've taken some important steps. So I wanted to just lift up a couple of these pieces. So the session that just ended in May included historic laws being passed that have the fingerprints of our tribes all over them. We made historic investments in housing, American Indian education, language revitalization, and so much more. Food security. We've made sure that all of the resources that we are putting forward for food security, the culturally specific foods are a part of that. Tribes are now eligible to apply for a lot of funding that they were previously denied, because we talk about local, state, right, county, and tribal governments in the way that we're doing funding. They can also use funding to expand their food shelves and food programming facilities. They have also, tribes shared with us challenges around reimbursement for traditional healing services through Medicaid. So we now provided grants for these cultural services and traditional healing that are not billable, to supplement the programs to assist with substance use disorders for tribes. And for the first time in decades, the state made a one-time increase to the treaty payments for 2 of our tribes, and will begin renegotiating the agreement towards future payments going forward. Tribes have also been denied the ability to apply for state funds, again, that I mentioned earlier, that counties and cities could. So we passed a $35 million in tribal nation aid that any tribe can apply for. And the state doesn't get to tell tribes how to use that money. That's not our job. They can use it for whatever is needed. And we know that that is their prerogative, and know what's best for their own people. We also made investments in tribal wellness centers, a tribal college, emergency coordination and services as well. And we passed a law that prohibits public schools in Minnesota from using mascots that depict American Indian people, symbols, images, and personalities, which takes us way back to the beginning of this conversation, that people don't know that we exist as contemporary people, and that the imagery can reinforce some of that that keeps us stuck in the past. So we know that we are making progress. We've made a lot of strides, but I think it is also making sure that we keep a lot of these wins in place going forward, and that the governor and I recognize that the separate relationship that we have with each tribal nation, they are not that's not a whole, it's not all 11 Native nations, it's not just Dakota and Ojibwe tribes, we have an individual relationship with each tribe, and the legislature must do that as well. And I think that is sort of the next place and space where we are moving and where we need to go. So long story long, we've done a lot. We've got more to do.
I say, wow,
thank you so much.
I love that description.
Yeah, that is super impressive. Makes me proud to call Minnesota home. And is also one of the reasons that we definitely wanted to make sure that you were here to share more about what can states do and how can states engage and operate and work differently and work better for the people. So just thank you so much. I want to ask oh no, staying on script. Excuse me, one moment. Coming back to the conversation, we heard a lot of different policies that you shared and a lot of different opportunities. But what's a first entry level policy option for state legislators that want to better support tribes in their state? And I'll start with Lieutenant Governor.
Sure. So this might seem like an answer where I'm dodging the question, but for the first step should be to open a dialogue directly with tribes. I have a lot of teachable moments that happen with folks who have a lot of good ideas about what tribes should be doing without ever speaking directly to tribes. Even I will give you an example. Even recently had someone talk about the need to, they're like, Upper Sioux, giving Upper Sioux back to the Yellow Medicine people is nice, but, like you could do more. Like, what about giving, Bedote at Fort Snelling back to, and I was like, so let's talk about that first part. Let's talk about that first part about Upper Sioux. This has been an ask and an ongoing conversation with the Yellow Medicine people to give back this state park, which was where literally they have burial grounds of their people. We are now able to give this back. The governor and Chairman Jensvold, the chairman of Upper Sioux, went to the Department of the Interior and met with the Assistant Secretary, Brian Newland, directly together to talk about this need. That took several years of building that relationship, building that trust, making sure that we are doing this in a good way and the right way in partnership with our legislators. And so I think sometimes there is this idea that non-Native people can speak on behalf of Native people without having a relationship there. And I think that is when we get ourselves into trouble. And even if there are folks who have the best intentions going into these conversations, oftentimes that is when some of the worst damage has been done to our people. And so I think I just want to name that as just an example. I was like, that's very interesting. We need to make sure that ask or that conversation starts with Dakota people. And there, it doesn't come from the state. It has to come from the tribes themselves. And I was like, I'm Ojibwe. I don't get to speak on behalf of Dakota people, right? I can only speak to my own experience. And so I think that's just an important piece. And, Governor Walz was the first governor to visit Upper Sioux since Governor Sibley, who literally was there to go to war with the Upper Sioux people. So it's a journey, I guess is what I would say. But so much of it is, I think people would expect, of course, like the lieutenant governor will go and meet with tribes. That's her community and what she would do. But I think that the important part, watching the governor as a non-Native person do this work, is that you just have to humble yourself. You just have to show up. I mean, I remember we went to a meeting, one of our first meetings when we were still just running together, and went to the Fond du Lac community and met with the tribal council. And it was a very long meeting, and many things were expressed. And that's what it takes. You have to just show up and listen and start to build that relationship before a lot of this work can occur. And that is the work, right? There's a lot of distrust between, local governments or state governments, or certainly the federal government, and rebuilding that trust takes a lot of time. And so, I think it's important to note that tribal citizens are also citizens of the state that they live in. And we need to acknowledge that as well. So we'd ultimately be doing a disservice to their own constituents by not building authentic relationships with these tribal nations. It is how you should operate. And, that's also an opportunity for folks. My hope is for all of you who are legislators to just go to a council meeting, ask to start building a relationship, show up in community, learn as much as you can. And I don't think you need to have the expectation, that tribes are going to do all of this work to educate you. There is an opportunity for you to learn about the culture, the history of the people who have been there since time immemorial, in many cases in the places where you live, to do some of that work on the front end and then begin to dig into to that relationship building. But so much of it is just like literally showing up and listening, and the solutions, the policies then come from there. Or there oftentimes are things that have been, the tribes have been working on for a very long time that haven't moved necessarily in the legislature. You have the opportunity to go back and see what some of those are, and perhaps you're the one who might be able to get those policies across the finish line. But I think it is starting with that relationship and starting with the tribes themselves first.
Thank you so much. I'm reminded of an episode of Rutherford Falls. If any of you follow that show, it was amazing comedy, where Regan, who is the main character, has left her community, comes back. She's going around trying to build relationships, and some of it is that, what you just said, that humbling of yourself, listening to people's complaints, maybe cleaning a toilet. Here or there, it's different opportunities. So I'll pass it to the professor. What's the first entry-level policy option for state legislators that want better support for tribes in their state?
Well, again,
who want to support tribes better?
Repeating the lieutenant governor, it's meeting with these tribal leaders. I do a lot of trainings for federal agencies and sometimes state agencies, and the city of Portland, I did a few last year. The number one thing I tell these employees of the whatever agency I'm training is, when you talk about a tribal chairman or chairwoman, you're talking about someone that's like on the rank of the county commissioner, or even let's say I will say the governor. I say you can't expect to just pick up the phone and call them, and you're a Forest Service employee and you're going to call to complain about what the tribe, they left their pickup on, whatever. There's a respect level and an understanding level and the knowledge that we've been talking about, that, as again, the lieutenant governor mentioned, a state legislature that didn't know we still existed. So treating a tribal chairman the same way you would the commissioner of a county there in Minnesota, if that's the title you use, that's what we use in Oregon and Arizona, treating them with that kind of respect. This is someone with more obligations and plates in the air, is that the right word, or things to think about and worry about, and just because you call doesn't mean they're going to answer the phone immediately or get back to you immediately. So it goes back to consultation, it goes back to cooperation, and understanding that this is on a government to government status. Again, I certainly tell the federal employees that come to my meetings, my trainings, and when a tribal government approaches you to talk about NAGPRA or NEPA issues or forestry issues under the various federal laws, this is a consultation government to government. You're not just talking to Joe Blow person from the public. You're talking to a representative of a constitutionally recognized government inside our United States. What do most Americans not know? We are taught from grade school forward there's two forms of governments, two forms of court systems in the United States. That is false. And if James Madison could sit up in his grave, he would go read Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. We know there are three governments, three court systems, three nationalities, or that's probably the wrong word, but three forms of citizenship in the United States. And so Indian people like the lieutenant governor and myself, we are federal citizens, we are state citizens, but we are citizens of our own tribal nations. That comes with some benefits, that comes with some obligations. So we are citizens, and that's what state officials need to know. They need to consult. And again, it's not like consulting with John Q. Public. It's as if they would call the local county commissioner and go, gee, we're thinking of doing X. What do you guys think? How would that impact you? Do you want to come down and have coffee with me? I mean, it's that kind of respect, acknowledgement of the office that these elected tribal leaders have, and the responsibility of their jurisdiction, the responsibility of their sovereign rights, and to cooperate in the environmental arena to be apropos to where we are today, again, for the greater good and the benefit of all. The more knowledge we have, the better decisions anyone can make. And I guess I wanted to mention...
Absolutely. Thank you.
Can I just throw in, Lieutenant Governor, what you said about this state park is extremely interesting. You folks might examine carefully what happened with the National Bison Range with the Confederated Tribes of Salish and Kootenai in western Montana. Now, that was not a state park, that was the federal bison range, but it was inside the tribe's reservation. And literally about 1 year ago, that was transferred, the land was transferred into trust by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to the tribe. So the Confederated Salish and Kootenai now not only operate the National Bison Range, they own it. Now, the example you gave us is of a state park, and that's an interesting, different twist. But you do have a pretty recent example out there of the National Bison Range.
Now you gave me homework, Professor. I'll do that homework. But I to just build on that point, I think that we hear a lot about, hashtag land back, right? And it is a rallying cry, and it is good policy. And I think that is our opportunity that we have here too, to be able to have these specific examples, like the one that the professor just shared, of like, we can literally do this and give land back and do it and return this land to tribes and do it in a really thoughtful and good way. And Brittany, to your point, I relate a lot to Reagan from Rutherford Falls. I married a guy who used to be on public radio, who's got glasses and a beard. So I would like to think that Rutherford Falls is a little bit inspired by my life. And she certainly had to chop a lot of wood to get back in, right, with her family and community. And that's a good model for the things that we have to do, to just show up and listen, and to just, in some ways, just do the work that has to be done before we can get to the thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you. I'm actually going to go into the chat. We had a question from Christina, and I know that this session is specifically geared towards state legislators, but a focus is not an exclusion, and state legislators cannot be there if it was not for the citizens. So question from Christina: how can we as citizens best help to make a positive impact for change? And I'll open that up to whoever would like to take that question first.
Professor, I can jump in here real fast, and then you should share what you've seen be effective ways to do this work. I can tell you what it's not. It is not shaming people on social media and then expecting them to sit down and have a meeting with you. So let's just get that out there. I think one of the gifts that I think that we have as Native people is the power of organizing that we just do inherently. And so much of that is through visiting. That really is what so much of the work that we do to be effective, to move things and to promote change, is just visiting. It is learning more about people, their families, what keeps them up at night, the things that they're proud of in their communities, and the things that they would like to see change. All of those tools are in our toolbox, and we need to use them. With the addition of social media, I think it has allowed us to talk, many to many, right? And to sort of, I think we saw a lot of the work that happened at Standing Rock. It changed everything because we had social media. Our stories are being told as Native people. The spotlight, we can tell our own stories. And I think Rutherford Falls, Res Dogs, and the other pieces of media that have grown out of that, that is because of that. But what I think it has also done in a negative way is prevented organizers from really doing the good work of building those relationships, of building trust, showing up, understanding people's motivations, and then being able to build from there. So I will just name that because I think one of the most effective things that you can do is to invite your legislators or decision makers, whoever they may be, into community to see the good work that you're doing. Don't just come to them always in a crisis. Have that on the front end so that you may need to rely on it in the future. The more personal, the better. Form emails, a handwritten letter, an email with a real story or narrative, or a face-to-face visit. If you can't come to the Capitol or the City Hall or where these decisions are being made, inviting that person in or finding them when they're in their community. That personal piece is what we are missing, and that is what gets it done. That I carry that story. I remember that interaction. We have done more over the last several years for our relatives experiencing homelessness because the governor and I did a shelter tour of 2 shelters, but then also shared a meal with people who are living under a bridge. That was the foundation for so much of the work that we've been able to do. So I just, you are an expert in your own life. You should be able to share and tell that story. That is the most important, most impactful tool that you have. And even if someone is of a different political persuasion than you and they're your representative, they still represent you. So sharing, making that connection, sharing that story, and building that relationship is the most powerful thing. Popping off on social media and then expecting to build a relationship, that's a strategy, it's a tactic, and sometimes it works. But if you are interested in that long term, there are other tools in our toolbox to build for that. And then if you need to escalate, you could do that too. But I would try to start remembering that the people who represent you are human beings and that you can find common ground.
Well, as a citizen is how I think this question was asked. What should all of us be doing? I mean, we have to interact with our elected officials, whether they're of our party or not. I think, as just the lieutenant governor was mentioning, my goodness, a letter, a phone call, showing up at one of their rallies and telling them what we are concerned with, I think that's what gets their attention. And yes, a polite approach. Yes, the screaming email or the screaming Facebook post is just a waste of time. So I guess I would just, if I understood the question, we vote, we donate money to the candidates we like, but we get involved because we ultimately hope, whether it's a Democrat or an independent or a Republican that's in office, we hope they're working for the betterment of the state and the betterment of all the citizens and the situations in that state. Surely they are, else I doubt they would have ever run for that office. What other reason do you get involved in politics? To add to, I think, what the lieutenant governor was saying also, a friend, a colleague of mine at work, she said, if you're going to work with Indians, you got to sit with Indians. And that's kind of a cute little phrase of hers, but you're going to sit with Indians. And that's exactly what the lieutenant governor was talking about, meeting with people. And so I suppose if we're going to work with politicians, we got to sit with politicians. Like, hey, that's the flip side, isn't it? They've got to hear from us, not in the screaming, whatever, but what are your concerns? What do you think we can do? What would your suggestion be about a solution, or what about this proposed solution? So it's being involved, it's being active, and taking the role of citizens in the United States, states, federal, and tribal citizens.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Going back to script, I want to make sure that we get this last question in, because we've already talked a lot about consultation and having those conversations and relationships. But what would it look like to promote consent between states and tribes when it comes to environmental decision making? And I am going to start with the professor first, and again, getting that legal perspective.
Well, I'm not certain how much legal perspective there is here, but to make environmental decisions is, of course, crucial to our life. We are quickly learning how crucial this is and how are we going to handle the issues that we're facing. So I think for state legislators and tribal legislators, cooperation, consultation, sharing of ideas, working towards common goals and objectives is crucial. And so state legislatures, just as they move out, as they reach out to anyone, they've got to reach out to also their tribal citizens and then the tribal leaders. I want to repeat what I said, and I tell this in trainings to state and city officials, etc. If you can have a tribal government supporting what you are lobbying Congress to do, my goodness, that adds power, and it adds the federal trust responsibility, gives you a whole new argument and a whole new arrow in your quiver, if we want to use that analogy, in making your argument. But talking about environmental things, I want to emphasize this point. tribal peoples have lived for thousands of years, since time immemorial in these landscapes. Just to use example of fires, I mentioned earlier the fires in Canada and the fires we had out here 2 years ago. Native peoples knew how to handle fire, knew how to manage prairies, manage landscapes, forest landscapes, and yes, to use fire, etc. There are other examples that the mainstream society can perhaps learn from traditional cultural solutions to environmental issues. So tribal or state leaders should be going to tribal leaders maybe to learn also. What's your view? What would your solution, what would a traditional solution be for the Anishinaabe people, the Ojibwe people, or my Shawnee people? So that's kind of an interesting twist on some of these environmental issues we're facing, that maybe tribal peoples could help craft a solution, not just be a supporter by consultation and by being consulted, but instead they could be a leader in devising solutions. The only way to find that out is to go to talk to those people and those leaders and those cultural leaders.
I will just, I would like
Thank
to
you, Professor.
associate myself with the professor's remarks. I think that's, I think he's right on. I would just say that there's still so much work to do on the consultation side. I would love for us to get to a place where we are able to move forward together with consent. And I just want to name that, like, that is hard to do. And it's hard to do. And before you can even get there, you have to do this relationship building work on the front end and come up with those best practices and solutions that come from community, and allow that opportunity for those conversations to occur and for those solutions to move forward. I think it comes up in many of the policies that we have proposed, the legislature has proposed, the governor's passed into law, the work that has come through state agencies, because of that consultation. In many ways, those are co-created policies. But that is the work, I think, that is required for folks really to do on the front end, as a professor named, and that there are so many things and so many ways that we have managed things over many generations that we need to be able to get back to some of those things. And one of the conversation stoppers and what prevents us from being able to do this work are people who say, we've never done it that way before, right? And I think having across your legislature, the people who work for your legislators, the folks who work at state agencies, we need desperately, and this is why the professor's job is so important, we desperately need so many more people who understand federal Indian law, who understand treaty rights and tribal sovereignty, because that's where, well, we've just never done it that way before. Oftentimes it's, we just ignored the law, right? We just haven't been doing what we are called to be doing because we don't understand it. And so much of that is code. So being able to have more people who have this understanding at decision-making tables, but also who are staff, not just for tribes, right, but for our state governments, for our county commissions, for our local school districts overall, that is needed and necessary, because I will editorialize for a moment. We just had a significant victory with Indian Child Welfare Act being reaffirmed by the Supreme Court. This will not be the last attack on treaty rights and tribal sovereignty. We have to be ready, and being able to have these good models at the state level for how this can work well is part of the battle, and having people prepared to be able to do this work really matters. So we need to enroll more people in Professor Miller's class. I'm done.
Well, and I'd like to quickly add, I wrote an article on consultation, a law review article in 2015, and surveyed how all the different federal agencies have been consulting and the requirements from presidential executive orders. So yes, there's a lot to learn about how best to consult between states, feds, and the tribal nations.
Thank you both so much. We could have literally this conversation and continue. There's so many more questions that were asked that we unfortunately can't get to at this time. But I just want to say again, thank you both for coming, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan and Professor Miller, sharing your time, your knowledge, your wisdom with our audience. We are really fortunate to be able to have your wisdom and these very concrete examples, these very concrete next steps, particularly for state legislators who are really wanting to do a better job. And my grandpa used to say, good intentions in a quarter will only get you a 25-cent drink. You have to put those good intentions with some action behind it. So there are some clear actions that have been shared and provided. And so at this time, again, thank you both so much for sharing with our audience. And we will now bring back Kate into the room and into the space.
Thanks, Brittany. I'll just echo so much gratitude to the Lieutenant Governor, Professor Miller. I have 6 pages of notes. Lieutenant Governor, I'll see you in Professor Miller's class in the fall. I'll be right there with you. I just want to close out with some next steps and kind of just reflect on the conversation that we just had, and 2 sound bites that stood out to me about why this work matters, particularly for state lawmakers. Lieutenant Governor said, when tribes are doing well, everyone benefits. And Professor Miller added, it just makes sense. So I think those are really indicative of why this work matters for lawmakers, for funders, for nonprofits, for advocates, for citizens. So thank you for putting it so succinctly. For those of you that tuned in, thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment to learning. We're going to be continuing this dialogue into the fall with an in-person event for legislators in August that you can find on NCEL's website, and also some more virtual convenings in the fall that all of y'all are invited to. And we'll be following up with a survey. So if anybody's interested in taking action or learning a little bit more about this conversation, we invite you to fill out that survey. I believe it's going to be put in the chat to let us know how we can support your work. But otherwise, we are just so grateful for the partnership with Native Americans in Philanthropy. Thank you all for being here. And we really look forward to continuing to promote tribal sovereignty and environmental decision making. So thank you all and be well.